Welcome back to my garden. It's the end of August and it's starting to feel like it. Although the weather is still really warm, the days are getting shorter and the plants seem to know this. Most of the flowering and fruiting plants seem to be at the end of that process. Some of them are starting to change color and drop leaves, as is natural for this time of year. But there are still plenty of things growing and thriving, so I'm going to show you some of the highlights. My cucumber really finished a couple of weeks ago. I only got about half a dozen cucumbers from it, and they were all kind of overwatered, bitter, and had thick skins. But it was a good first attempt. The grapes did pretty nicely this year. I kept the fruits covered with these nets to protect them from pests, and I did get a really nice harvest from them. The grapes are really sweet, and they were eaten all up in about a day. I do apologize for keeping these two beds netted while showing you the plants inside them, but earlier this month we had a mantis hatching, and they have really taken a liking to the netting. They crawl all over it and hunt, and so I have to be very careful when I work in these beds because I don't want to harm them. They are very small and sometimes hard to see and blend in easily. They are good little allies in pest control, and given that one of these netted beds is infested with whitefly, I figure I better do all I can to protect these little predators. Besides that, they're just kind of cute and I love watching them hunt. So I've got quite a variety of different plants in this bed. At right is the second crop of the radishes I grew earlier this year. There are also two arugula, which I've let go to seed because they were the only two who popped up. Here's where I recently harvested 3 cabbage, and there's still one left, which should be ready in the next couple weeks. In their place, I've sown mizuna, buttercrunch lettuce, Bates collards, and some daikon. On this side we have alternating rows of red bok choy and tatsoi. These are densely planted and tend to be bigger toward the middle of the bed, I think because of the sun exposure. Here's one celeriac that deigned to germinate, and a couple of shiso or perilla, which I planted a long time ago, and they've just been very slow to grow. This is the bed that's infested with whitefly, but the plants are doing a little better. I think the increased water has helped. On this side we have a Swiss chard, which has finally grown high enough to harvest. There are about half a dozen kale plants here, from which I've harvested quite a bit. There are a couple more rows of alternating tatsoi and pak choi to the right there. In the center are about a dozen plants of gailan or Chinese broccoli, from which I've harvested quite a bit. And on the left here is the heirloom broccoli or Calabrese. It hasn't produced any heads yet, but as you can see it has grown and filled out quite a bit so that it's pushing to the top of the netting. I have plans to modify the netting to give these plants a little more space. Here's one of our little mantises hard at work guarding the broccoli. This one's about an L3 size, meaning it's molted twice since it was born, so it's about halfway to adulthood at this point. My Mexican sour gherkins still haven't produced any fruit. I have about 6 distinct plants here, but their flowering has been so infrequent that even if I wanted to help by hand pollinating, there aren't usually male and female flowers blooming at the same time. I do have one little male flower here that's just getting ready to bloom, and I've got one female flower that has grown all the way up into this spider web, so hopefully the male flower will bloom in time for me to hand pollinate that one, and we'll see if we get any fruit. This patch of zinnias has been such a joy this year. It's producing lots of tall flowers of all different colors, ranging from white to bright red, and the hummingbirds have really taken a liking to this. In fact, they'll sit on the pepper cages right next door and guard the zinnias from other hummingbirds and fight and chase them away. So it's been really fun to watch their comings and goings and their behavior, since this is the first year I've really seen a lot of hummingbirds in the garden. This star jasmine previously resided in a basket in an opposite corner of the garden, but I decided to plant it here in the ground and train it up around this column because I really love the way it smells and I wanted it a little bit closer to the patio where we sit so that I can actually enjoy the scent instead of having to walk all the way across the garden to do it. It also is great for attracting hummingbirds. The scora has grown to an almost problematic size and produced a lot of flowers that are bringing around bees and butterflies, and even hummingbirds are enjoying it. Behind that is the Mexican tarragon, which has gotten really tall and I'm hoping will flower soon. And my marjoram is already flowering. I'm just happy to see these plants doing so well because they were grown from seed and had a rough start. As you can see, the gora is completely blocking this path, and so I have to be really careful when I walk through here so that I don't completely destroy the plant. Once it's finished flowering, I think I'll cut it back and actually move it over next to the zinnia patch where the Clary Sage currently lives. The Clary Sage is kind of a short plant and I don't think it's really getting enough light here, which is probably why these plants haven't flowered yet. There are also probably a dozen plants in this little 2x1 foot box, so I think they're a little overcrowded and will do a little bit better in a sunnier, drier spot. My plan for the peppers this year was to grow a bunch of different Mexican varieties, smoke them, and then turn them into a mole paste. Unfortunately, the plants all kind of got off to a slow start, so the harvests have been really irregular and staggered and not as abundant as I'd hoped. I finally have a couple of Guajillo coming on, and this is the first I've seen of them, so I'll be harvesting those soon. And these Aji Rico actually came on quite a while ago, and they're just now ripening. It's taken about a month for them to just ripen. It's not a complete loss, though, as I've made a couple of really delicious salsas. It looks a little washed out on the video camera and is perhaps just past its prime, but this pelargonium has been amazing this year. It's one of the first plants I bought. It's been moved several times in the garden, and it's just tough as nails. I have yet to kill it, which is great. It seems to survive in just about any soil and is just gorgeous. This was where I previously had a butterfly bush that was just getting too large for the space, so I removed it and gave it to a friend. Despite that, it has magically resprouted. In its place, I wanted to put these showy milkweed, which were doing really well until I attempted to move them, and as you can see, many of them died. However, showy milkweed are really tough plants, and they grow by rhizomes, so they have little sprouts coming up next to the ones that have died. There are also sprouts coming up in the place that I transplanted them from. The San Marzano tomato seems to be getting toward the end of its growing cycle. It hasn't produced very many tomatoes this year, and I think in part that was due to under-pollination. Last year I noticed it was primarily pollinated by the yellow-faced bumblebee, but I haven't seen as many of those around this year. As I mentioned last month, the tropical milkweed has really been the crowning jewel of the garden this year. It has such striking flowers, was easy to germinate, and grew quickly, and it has attracted so many different creatures to it, in particular the Anna's hummingbird, which really have done a great job of pollinating it. It's also attracted plenty of honeybees and wild bees, and thanks to the pollination, it's producing these fruiting bodies from which I can collect more seed for next year. After a slight lull in July, the bug hotels seem to be bustling with activity again, in particular by leafcutter bees that are starting to occupy more and more of these little holes and tubes. Here you can see the different colored plant materials that they use to fill their nests. They build little chambers in these tubes and fill them with eggs, which then hatch into larvae that feed on pollen, and eventually they emerge as adult bees. Unfortunately, last week I found 3 bee larvae that had been aborted from their nest, which is evident from the vacated tubes there toward the center. There are a lot of reasons this might happen, but since then the bees seem to be reoccupying those tubes and are laying more eggs that will hopefully produce viable offspring in the near future. I've been trying for a couple of years to get a New York aster established here, and this one is finally taking off. This is a fall blooming variety, and the flowers are opening just in time. I specifically chose this variety to extend the foraging period for the local insect population. And speaking of insect-friendly plants, this little patch of a beneficial seed mix that I scattered here is starting to fill in nicely, and the globe candy tuft is starting to bloom. It is pretty late in the year, so I'm not sure how much bigger these plants will get before the first frost. Earlier this year I was worried about the fate of my sweet alyssum, as it didn't look very healthy, and I had given it quite a brutal cutback. But as you can see, those fears were entirely unwarranted, as another walking path is now entirely occupied and unusable thanks to the amount of alyssum growing into it. I'm thinking the solution to this might be to install some kind of low fence border rather than the brick border here, since it doesn't do much to keep the alyssum from spilling into the pathway. The blanket flower remains a favorite with all of the pollinators that visit the garden. It was still blooming well into November last year and has been such a delight to look at this year that I'm hoping with continuous deadheading it will continue to produce blooms well into late fall. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten any ground cover well established in here, and opportunistic weeds have filled in the spaces where water runs off from the beds. Some of these weeds happen to be edible, like this purslane here. This particular specimen is no longer suitable for consumption since it's gone to seed. This year I'm going to work hard to get a more suitable ground cover established so that there's not so much free space for weeds to occupy. Thank you for once again joining me on a tour of my garden. As this growing season nears its end, I'm hatching many more plans to make this space more amenable to the local insect population. As always, if you have any questions or recommendations, please leave them in the comments down below. Happy gardening! See you next time.